Welcome to the Interzone Podcast, Episode 1, the case of Karla Faye Tucker. Now, a lot of people in America will probably already know quite a bit about this case. It caused quite a lot of controversy, especially in the 90s. But I'm from Australia and I was completely unaware of Karla Faye Tucker and her execution, which happened to be under, at that time, Governor George W. Bush in Texas. And the reason this case is so interesting to me is there's a lot of elements that have sort of come together, culminating in a lot of areas that I have a lot of knowledge of or I'm interested in. Now, funnily enough, I discovered this case quite by accident, watching and this is not to insult Christians, but a terrible, terrible Christian film called Forevermore, which is about her conversion to Christianity in prison and the relationship between her and the pastor, or whatever it's called, who ended up marrying her. And what was the most interesting part of this horrible movie was at the end they actually showed footage of the real Karla Faye Tucker. And with absolutely no context, when I had watched this film, I was just going, oh, she's just pretending to be a Christian to try and get off being executed. Typical psychopath. And then I saw the real Karla Faye Tucker at the end in the credit sequence. And what shocked me was her astounding charisma. And this was not normal kind of charisma. This is something that, even though psychopaths are known for being charismatic, they're really not. You can tell a difference. This woman was something different. There was something almost magical about this woman. I have almost never seen anybody with the level of charisma that this tiny bit of footage of her in prison displayed. And this made me very interested in the case because I started to now go, maybe she isn't a psychopath who's utilizing Bible Belt Christians to try and get herself out of being executed. Maybe she is legitimately a Christian. And I believe her conversion to Christianity was very sincere. And I'm going to be going into this case, mostly one area of this case, which is associated with the kind of work that I've done. And anybody who knows me from my YouTube channel and the work I've done on there's one key theme that props up in almost everything I talk about. And this all started with me analysing Christian, and that is through the lens of demonic possession. I never intended to make those videos on Christian. I actually started out, and the first thing I was planning to do was to make a podcast and going through cases like Karla Faye Tucker, and through the lens of demonic possession, try and analyze certain things. To come at it from a different perspective, given that I'm not a Christian, I'm not a religious person. I come from a purely occult background. It's heavily steeped in magic and the works of Aleister Crowley and Thelema. That's my sort of point of view and perspective. And like using Christian as a pop culture figure to try and explain to people who might not be exposed to magic or demonology and things like that, how demons operate in the lens of demonic possession. I'm looking at this case as another kind of pop culture figure that I believe demonic possession being an integral part of what was involved. So rather than focusing so much on the conversion and her execution, I will be focusing on the crime itself and the period of time leading up to it. And I've put together court documents I've found and also articles written about her. And they're all terrible. Pretty much all the articles written about her. It's terrible journalism. And it's really condescending because she was a drug addict and she was from a very bad area of Texas and, you know, treated as total white trash. It's actually insulting in the way that they represent these people. And my kind of focus in this is mostly going to be on her very heavy use of methamphetamine and how that is integral to what could have led to what I believe her being demonically possessed during the period she committed this crime. Anyway, what I'm going to do is start with a general overview of the whole situation. And then I'm going to go into much more detail. I'll assume that people don't know anything about the case. And remember, I am from Australia, not from America, so I might get some things wrong culturally or not understand certain aspects. But I do really think this is a very interesting case, and I'll start with the general overview. Okay. Karla Faye Tucker, born the 18th of November 1959, was an American woman sentenced to death for killing 2 people with a pickaxe during a burglary. That's already inaccurate, but anyway, she only killed 1 person. She was the first woman to be executed in the United States since Velma Barfield in 1984 in North Carolina, and the first in Texas since Chipita Rodriguez in 1863. She was convicted of murder in Texas in 1984 and executed by lethal injection after 14 years on death row. Due to her gender and widely publicized conversion to Christianity, she inspired an unusually large national and international movement that advocated the commutation of her sentence to life without parole, a movement that included a few foreign government officials. Early life. Now I'm just going through her Wikipedia. I'll be going into much more detail about the case after this, but this is a good summary, I guess. Karla Tucker was born and raised in Houston, Texas, the youngest of 3 sisters. Her father, Larry, was a longshoreman. The marriage of her parents was troubled, and Tucker started smoking cigarettes with her sisters when she was 8 years old. During her parents' divorce proceedings when she was 10 years old, Tucker learned that her birth was a result of an extramarital affair. By age 12, she had begun taking drugs and having sex. She dropped out of school at age 14 and followed her mother, Carolyn, a rock groupie, into prostitution, and began traveling with the Allman Brothers Band, the Marshall Tucker Band, and the Eagles. At 16, she was briefly married to a handyman named Stephen Griffith. When she was in her early 20s, she began hanging out with bikers and met a woman named Shawn Dean and her husband, Jerry Lynn Dean. The couple introduced her in 1981 to a man named Daniel Ryan Garrett, or Danny Garrett. Then 21 years old, Tucker started dating 35-year-old Garrett. Murders. After spending the weekend using drugs with Garrett and their friends, and I'll go into what they were doing. They weren't just using drugs. I mean, they were hitting it hard. I'll read it out after exactly what she was doing from her court case archives that I've gotten a hold of. Tucker and Garrett entered Jerry Dean's apartment in Houston, Texas around 3 a.m. on Monday, June 13, 1983, intending to steal a motorcycle that Dean was restoring there. James Librand, a friend, went with them to Dean's apartment complex. Librand reported that he went looking for Dean's El Camaro, while Tucker and Garrett entered the apartment with a set of keys that Tucker claimed Sean Dean had lost and Tucker had found. This burglary, I'll go into more detail afterwards, but they didn't go in with the intention of murdering anybody. It was meant to be a burglary to steal the motorcycle, essentially, but I'll go into that more later. During the burglary, Tucker and Garrett entered Dean's bedroom, where Tucker sat on him. In an effort to protect himself, Dean grabbed Tucker about the elbows, whereabout Garrett intervened. Garrett struck Dean numerous times in the back of the head with a ball pen hammer that he found on the floor. After hitting Dean, Garrett left the room to carry motorcycle parts out of the apartment. Tucker remained in the bedroom. The blows Garrett had dealt Dean caused him to begin making a gurgling sound. I mean, the guy was screwed by then. He's already dead, choking on his own blood. Tucker wanted to stop him from making that noise. And she then picked up a 3-foot pickaxe that was lying against the wall and began hitting Dean. Garrett then re-entered the room and dealt Dean a final blow in the chest. So Garrett actually technically killed the guy, the first one. Garrett left the bedroom again to continue loading Dean's motorcycle parts into his Ford Ranchero. Tucker was once again left in the room and only then noticed a woman who had hidden under the bed covers against the wall. The woman, Deborah Ruth Thornton, had argued with her husband the day before, went to a party, and ended up spending the night in Dean's bed. Upon discovering Thornton, Tucker grazed her shoulder with the pickaxe. Thornton and Tucker began to struggle, but Garrett returned and separated them. Tucker proceeded to hit Thornton repeatedly with the pickaxe and then embedded the axe in her heart. Tucker would later tell people and testify that she experienced intense multiple orgasms with each blow of the pickaxe. Now, this is a bit of a warning sign with regards to demonic entities, and this is quite common. John Wayne Gacy, when he killed his first victim, it was essentially a misunderstanding, and when he stabbed the boy with the knife that he was carrying, and I forgot the context, but he orgasmed, which was one of the things that led him down the path of becoming a prolific serial killer. Anyway, the next morning, one of Dean's co-workers who had been waiting for a ride entered the apartment and discovered the victims' bodies. Police investigation led to the arrest of Tucker and Garrett 5 weeks after the killings. Trial. In September 1983, Tucker and Garrett were indicted for murder and tried separately for the crimes. Tucker was charged with the murders of both Dean and Thornton, but after she testified against Garrett at his trial, the charge for the murder of Thornton was dropped. Garrett was not charged with Thornton's death either. Tucker entered a plea of not guilty and was jailed awaiting trial. Soon after being imprisoned, Tucker took a Bible from the prison ministry program and read it in her cell. She later recalled, "I didn't know what I was reading. Before I knew it, I was in the middle of my cell's floor, on my knees. I was just asking God to forgive me." Tucker became a Christian in October of 1983. She later married by proxy her prison minister, Reverend Dana Lane Brown, in 1995, and held her Christian wedding ceremony inside the prison. The relationship between the Reverend Dana and Karla Faye Tucker and their romance in prison is what that Forevermore film, that terrible, terrible film, was essentially about. Conviction. Though the death penalty was hardly ever sought for female killers, Tucker, along with Garrett, was sentenced to death in late 1984. Garrett died of liver disease in 1993 while awaiting execution. Tucker shared her death row cell at the Mountain View unit with Pam Perillo, whose own sentence was eventually commuted. Between 1984 and 1992, requests for a retrial and appeals were denied, but on June 22nd, Tucker requested that her life be spared on the basis that she was under the influence of drugs at the time of the murders. Tucker said that she was now a reformed person, and if she had not taken the drugs, the murders would never have been committed. I absolutely agree with what she's saying here. Usually I would not, but in her case, and the amount of drugs she was taking, especially the fact that she was injecting very large doses of methamphetamine every couple of hours for 2 weeks straight, was, and I'll go into that soon, but I have a lot of experience being around this kind of world. I grew up in, when I won't go into too many personal details, but I've gone on crazy drug binges in the same way, in the same extremes that Karla Faye Tucker was doing. And I have a few insights, especially with regards to methamphetamine. Methamphetamine being a massive problem in Australia, and especially the strange effect meth has on some people. It gives some, anyway, I'll go into that soon. Her plea drew support from abroad and also some leaders of American conservatism, although those who appealed to the state of Texas on her behalf were Brace Wiley Nadine, I'm butchering that name anyway, from the United Nations Commissioner on Summary and Arbitrary Executions, the World Council of Churches, even Pope John Paul II, Italian Prime Minister Romano Prodi, the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich, televangelist Pat Robertson, and Ronald Carlson, the brother of Tucker's murder victim, Debbie Thornton. She got a lot of support. It was very strange. This whole case is very strange. The warden of Texas Huntsville prison testified that she was a model prisoner and that after 14 years on death row, she likely had been reformed. The board rejected her appeal on January 28, 1998, hours before the execution. Texas Governor and future President George W. Bush Jr. refused the final 11th hour appeal to block her execution. On death row, Tucker was incarcerated in the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. She became Texas Department of Criminal Justice Death Row Inmate 777. Now that's really interesting to me. 777 having been a huge deal within Kabbalism. Crowley even wrote his book. He named the very famous book of Kabbalistic correspondences and gematria 777. It has huge occult significance. Anyway, on February 2nd, 1998, state authorities took Tucker from the unit in Gatesville and flew her on a TDCJ aircraft, transporting her to the Huntsville unit. For her last meal, Tucker requested a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. She selected 4 people to watch her die, who included her sister, Carrie Weeks, her spouse, Dana Brown, her close friend, Jackie Onken, and Roland Carlson. At one time, Carlson had supported the execution, but after a religious conversion, he decided that he was now opposed to all executions. The witnesses for the murder victims included Thornton's husband, Richard, Thornton's only child, William Joseph Davis, and Thornton's stepdaughter, Katie. Tucker's execution was also witnessed by members of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Warden Baggett, and various representatives of the media. Her last words were, "Yes, sir, I would like to say to all of you, the Thornton family and Jerry Dean's family, that I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this." She looked at her husband. "Baby, I love you." She looked at Ronald Carlson. "Ron, give Peggy a hug for me." She looked at all present, weeping and smiling. "Everybody had been so good to me. I love all of you very much. I'm going to be face to face with Jesus now." Warden Baggett, "Thank all of you so much. You have been so good to me. I love you all very much. I will see you when you get there. I will wait for you." She was executed by a lethal injection on February 3rd, 1998. As the deadly chemicals were being administered, she praised Jesus Christ, licked her lips, looked at the ceiling, and hummed. She was pronounced dead at 6:45 p.m. Central Standard Time, 8 minutes after receiving the injection. And lethal injection is a nasty way of killing someone. It's not like in the old days where they would inject you with, in Texas, where they injected you with 30 milligrams of hydromorphone, where you just get to fade out. They inject you with a paralyzing agent that allows you to feel everything, essentially. And then they induce a heart attack. And usually they botch the executions and they go on sometimes for 40 minutes or more. Anyway, she was buried at Forest Lake Lawndale Cemetery in Houston. Tucker was the first woman executed in the state of Texas in 135 years, when Chipita Rodriguez was executed by hanging in 1863 during the American Civil War, and the second woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976. Aftermath. In the year following her execution, conservative commentator Tucker Carlson, and this is interesting, he questioned Governor Bush about how the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles had arrived at the determination on her clemency plea. Tucker Carlson alleged that Bush, alluding to a television interview which Karla Faye Tucker had given to talk show host Larry King, smirked and spoke mockingly about her. That's interesting that George W. Bush had that kind of attitude. And it's very interesting that he did essentially kill her. And a typical psychopath, when they get away with something, they get a huge rush of norepinephrine, and they get what's called duper's delight, which is a slight smirk, usually of one of the corners of their mouths. And anyway, so yeah, George W. Bush was not very respectful. A full-length movie was released in 2004. That's the film I watched, about the life of Tucker, entitled Forevermore, blah, blah, blah. The captain of the Death House team, Fred Allen, was interviewed by... Anyway, that's a good introduction to her case. But the reason I find it so interesting is a bit more complex. I'll go into it now. Like I mentioned earlier, what has sort of drawn me to this case is the heavy drug use she was using 2 weeks prior to the murders, and also a theory I have on demonic possession, essentially. It's quite interesting how many times I end up on the side with Christians, despite a lot of Christians probably thinking that I'm some kind of Satanist. But yeah, I find they didn't go to the extreme that I am of accusing her of being demonically possessed during the crimes, of course, but I'm going to go there. Now, what I'm going to first do is read from a now extinct article that goes into more detail on the night of the murder, because I'm not interested so much in what happened after the crime, but what led up to her committing this very, very brutal murder. So this is not written by me. Whoever wrote this, it's somebody who obviously thinks of themselves as quite a writer when they're not. It's full of adjectives and assumptions, and it's very condescending towards the people who come from these kind of backgrounds, which is kind of offensive to me, and it's very unfair with the assumptions they make. But this is the best I could find about the actual night of the murders, and I'm going to mix in certain court documents I was able to find that might be able to shed some light on this whole situation. Petite, curly-haired, 23-year-old Karla Faye Tucker, when not glazy-eyed under the effects of a multitude of drugs she tended to swallow at one sitting. I absolutely hate the state of journalism. It's a very condescending way to put it. May have looked like some proud mother's honor student. The fresh-faced Texan, however, at the time June 13th, 1983 rolled around, had lived a life hard enough to have erased any schoolgirl wispiness from the core of her eyes. As I said, this guy obviously thinks of himself as a writer, but it is absolutely terrible journalism. And it's the best I can get. Innocence hadn't solely evaporated in Karla Faye's case. It had been devoured painfully, masticated by a world that chewed her up halfway before she learned to bite back. She would later describe herself during that period in her life as being a mixed-up, peer-pressured radical whose life had been a succession of last-minute decisions, all without fear of consequence, all bad, all rotten. If one were to watch her face as the sun went down that June 1983, they would have seen the expression of someone who was as she were to tell TV interviewer Larry King years later, crazy, violent. A party had been in force for 3 days in the small brick house in Houston, Texas. There, Karla Faye lived with 37-year-old Daniel Garrett, described in his world as a pill doctor, a provider of pills. Obviously someone who was being paid to write prescription medications. Inspiration for the weekend bash was the birthday of Carrie Ann, Karla's oldest sister, and as it steamed on, had developed into something more than the high everyone hoped. Inhibitions disappeared as well as clothing. Carrie had wanted a sex orgy, and her celebrants were eager to give her one. Garrett and the partiers en masse were like Karla Faye, whose existence had culminated in a no life of drug and booze. Come on, you don't know that. Typical condescending middle class. Anyway, both factors were predominant at the bash. Beer, whiskey, and tequila provided a means to wash down the desert tray of Placadils, Dilaudid, Valium, Mandrex, and more. Much, much more. I'll actually go and read out what she was actually on. And this was over a 2-week period. This is from her 1992 evidentiary hearing. Furthermore, finding 8 utterly fails to address the fact that the applicant was severely under the influence of drugs on the night of the offense. As the record reflects, in a time of approximately 2 weeks prior to the offense and continuing until the night of the offense, applicant was using methadone, heroin, Dilaudid, which is hydromorphone, Valium, Placadils, which is dextropropoxyphene, probably propoxyphene, which is a strong synthetic or opioid, Somas, which are a skeletal muscle relaxant, Lysergics, which is probably another painkiller, I forget, Percodan, which is OxyContin, Mandrex, which are Quaaludes, and marijuana, as well as consuming large quantities of alcohol. On the weekend before the murders, specifically on Friday, applicant ingested her normal array of pills and also was shooting a lot of speed, quote. She was, by speed, they're referring to methamphetamine. And I'll go into another court document quickly and go back into the story. Okay, this is from amendment petition for writ of habeas corpus. As to the applicant's state of mental health, on June 13th, 1983, the date of the offense, and the time preceding that as it relates to drugs, Dr. Felkins testified that at this time she was doing drugs on a daily basis and had been for over a year. She was doing the equivalent of 80 milligrams of methadone. Sometimes she did methadone, which is a narcotic, and it's an oral liquid. Sometimes she did IV Dilaudid, and sometimes she did IV heroin, depending on what was available. But at any rate, she did a narcotic every day, maybe once a day if it's the methadone, or 3 or 4 to 5 times a day if it was the Dilaudid or heroin. She had been doing this for over a year and was probably addicted to narcotics. Yeah, no shit, she was definitely addicted to opiates. In addition, she was drinking more and her drinking was intermittent. Like her drugs, but at this time she was drinking heavily. She was doing Valiums, Lysergics, Placadils, Somas, and some Percodans. sorry, some of these brands aren't in Australia. We have OxyContin and stuff, but yeah, so I'm butchering some of the names. All of these were in pills that she had gotten by prescription. She was also doing Mandrex and doing various amounts. Now that's Quaaludes. Quaaludes are extremely potent, hypnotic sedative, stronger than most barbiturates, and probably one of the most intense and fun downers you can do. However, they no longer exist anymore. In addition to all these drugs, most of which are downers, tend to make a person sleepy or sluggish. She was doing cocaine, which is a mixed kind of drugs. It makes people irritable and anxious and up. And she was doing, this is the interesting part, she was doing speed that she was doing intravenously. She usually did not do speed on a regular daily basis, but had been for 2 weeks prior to the incident, doing speed every few hours intravenously for a 2-week period prior to the incident. So along with her usual opiates and downers, she was taking high doses of methamphetamine. And she was not used to taking methamphetamine. And one thing to know about meth is snorting it or smoking it can't give you even a comparison to the effect of injecting it intravenously. When it's injected intravenously in high doses, and a lot of the reason all these drugs that I listed that she was taking these kind of drug cocktails on especially on binges that start with cocaine or meth, you usually end up ingesting something every 10 minutes because the methamphetamine just completely takes over. Now I know this because when I was younger, I've gone on horrendous drug binges like the one Karla Faye did, which ended in a murder. And I'm not going to say that it takes away responsibility completely, but drugs like meth in particular, meth is the worst thing in the world. It is the worst drug. It opens you up, and especially when you have not slept in a long period of time, your psychic self, your kind of psychic firewall completely breaks down. And I've seen a lot of meth psychosis and had to deal with a lot of people, especially when they go crazy and they get very violent. And you can have some skinny guy and he will not stop, even with multiple guys much bigger than him doing everything possible to get the guy down. You have to beat, no matter what you do, they just won't stop when they're in this state of methamphetamine-induced psychosis. They have a superhuman strength to them. And where a tiny, skinny guy can take on 5 security guards and they still need help from outsiders, and the violence only ends when 15 cops show up and taser the guy. Now, what's interesting also is not everybody goes into these kind of psychotic episodes, and they're very particular to meth. People, the way they behave, you don't see it with cocaine. You don't even see it with old-fashioned amphetamine. Meth psychosis is something almost unique. And when I've been on high doses of methamphetamine for days during these stupid binges when I was much younger, I don't do any of this stuff anymore. This was way back. And the common effect of starting to see shadow people and all that stuff, I used to just attribute it all to just being part of the lack of sleep and something that must be chemically going on from the methamphetamine. But my attitude to this has changed over the years. I believe that methamphetamine opens you up to being able to see beyond the veil, in a sense. But unlike some other drugs that can also do these kind of things, it does it in a way that is, you're completely unprotected. And the shadow people, what's interesting about that is I've never had that kind of phenomenon happen except when I've been on these binges, right? Except when I've been around somebody who is going through, who has a severe mental illness and is going into a state of extreme bipolar mania or psychosis. This has nothing to do with drugs now, but I was a year ago around a friend of mine who had very bad bipolar and went into an extreme manic episode. And I was having to try and take care of them while they were going through this. And I started to, after a few days of this, I started to see the same kind of shadow people effect manifesting around me that I'd only ever gotten years and years before on these stupid drug binges I used to go on. And that got me thinking that maybe there's a little bit more to what's going on than just psychosis. And also, why did I never go into a state of typical meth psychosis when I had done these binges, when people around me would fall into that? Is it because I have, and I had less of a tolerance than these people, and I was doing just as much as them, yet I would never go into the kind of psychosis that I would see. And I think everybody has a level of a psychic firewall almost. And some people are more vulnerable than others. And I believe that I never went into a crazy psychotic rage where 15 people have to physically stop me from doing something completely insane and all that stuff. I never got into any state like that. Yet associates of mine did. And they'd even do things like be able to jump fences, like guys in their late 40s in bad condition. and like they were gymnasts. So yeah, for years and years, I always blamed meth itself, but I am starting to believe that these people, from the mixture of the lack of sleep and the high doses of methamphetamine, is opening up their psyche to being attacked and entered by entities. And that the shadow people commonly see when they use high doses of methamphetamine, I think that you're actually seeing beyond the veil. You're seeing entities. As strange as all that sounds. And the only thing that was probably saving Karla Faye Tucker during her huge drug binge where this was on was the downers she was taking. Because I've talked about in other videos that things like heroin and opiates, opium, morphine, they almost have a protective effect on you and your psyche. That is when you're on them. As soon as you stop taking them, or especially if you go into withdrawal, you're opened up completely. But in the case of Karla Faye Tucker, the 2 week of injecting speed every 2 hours and it culminating in this murder, I absolutely believe something entered her. I'll go into the murder itself. Essentially, because I've already taken much more time than I expected recording this, but essentially it was a botched robbery. They had a guy in a getaway car. They were going to try and either steal the guy's bike, steal the bikie's bike parts to kind of shame him. And the reason they wanted to do this was that the guy was a wife beater. And at that party that I mentioned earlier for Karla Faye Tucker's sister, who they got so worked up, and they were using they had a meth lab set up in the house they were in. So they had a pretty much unending supply of gear. And they got more and more and more pissed off because the girl who was married to the guy was covered in bruises and had been beaten quite savagely by him. So they wanted to get revenge by messing up his motorcycle. However, the guy kept his motorcycle essentially in the living room right next to the bedroom, not in the garage. And the motorcycle was in parts. He was essentially he was working on it. And he woke up and the guy Karla Faye Tucker was with started beating him, and then with the hammer. And then something kind of flipped in her. And this is the same case with a lot of other people who I've looked into who have ended up committing really, really brutal murders. I've talked about it before in the most interesting case you will ever find, which I'll probably re-record my original version of, which is the case of Harvey Church. Like Karla Faye Tucker, when he saw the blood, something changed in him and he went crazy, as he put it. And Karla Faye Tucker, on all this meth mixed with the other drugs, not sleeping for 2 weeks. Once the violence kicked in, I believe that a entity of some form had managed to get into her. And then when she noticed the girl who was hiding, she picked up the closest thing to her, which happened to be a pickaxe. So when she saw the blood, something clicked in her. And you can't completely blame methamphetamine for this, because otherwise people like me would have a high chance of being near. I've been in very violent situations, yet I never flipped and started doing what Karla Faye did. And that's because she did not have any form of psychic protection. She has had a pretty rough and horrible life. And it all culminated in this moment where because she didn't just kill the lady, she went crazy with it and just hit her again and again and again and again. And she mentions how she orgasmed multiple times. And this is very interesting because a lot of times with people who have been demonically possessed and have certain and start doing certain behaviors, for instance, and this is going to sound strange and mundane, but people who are kleptomaniacs, who shoplift, when they get away with it, and sometimes they can be seen literally orgasming. And this isn't no normal kind of human response to this stuff. There's something else going on there. And I believe that the methamphetamine opened Karla Faye Tucker up to being demonically possessed. And then in that moment during that crime, the entity had full control. Because when demons enter people, they tend to want to release, to feel the most intense feelings as possible. They tend to want to experience things because they can't do it without a physical form. And it's usually something quite extreme, because they need that release of neurochemicals, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine in particular, to be released. And the act of killing someone releases huge amounts of neurochemicals into the prefrontal cortex. And essentially, I believe that this entity took advantage of that moment. And then once she was arrested, as soon as she was essentially useless to the entity, that the entity then left Karla Faye Tucker. And then the real person, whatever was left within her shattered consciousness, started to be sort of put back together when she was incarcerated with the methamphetamine, which was a drug she was not used to. This is probably her first real binge on meth. When she was imprisoned, almost immediately took to Christianity after she had obviously sobered up, and they were probably putting her on the methadone program and stuff to help alleviate withdrawals. But yeah, the entity had no more use for her. And then outside of that harsh environment of which she was trapped in, and away from the heavy amounts of narcotics she was using, her consciousness that remained was finally able to come through. And that's where this dramatic shift in character happened. And this is why I don't believe she was a psychopath who was faking the Christian stuff. She got into the Christian stuff within essentially as soon as she was within a year. And she was on death row for a long time. And I'll be stopping soon, but there's a lot of other elements to this case, and it's quite a sexist one, but I won't go into that aspect of things. I'm just trying to focus more on the occult aspect. And the charisma that she showed in prison and in videos is unbelievable. That is not a psychopath. That is somebody who had great potential. And yeah, I agree with the Christians, but I think it's a step further than just the drugs. But, I don't know. These are all theories based upon a mixture of my involvement in occultism and also with a history of being around these types of people and having done these kinds of things that Karla Faye Tucker had done when I was younger. And I think that brings a different element to it. And one day I'll conclude with this. One day I will make a video about the effects of drugs in, not just in magic, but with regards to demonic possession, which seems to be a theme in all my work. And I talk about this stuff in a way to try and educate people. Even if you don't believe in any of this stuff, the protection of your consciousness should be of absolute paramount importance in your life, because there are so many factors of things that can get involved that can have something, be it an archetypal thing from the collective unconscious or the subconscious coming up in a Jungian way, or whatever way you want to think it, a metaphorical demon within you come out. And drugs, especially marijuana and hallucinogens, are absolutely terrible with regards to opening people up to being demonically possessed or possessed by these demonic archetypes. Anyway, I hope people have found this interesting. I haven't really been able to give the full case of Karla Faye Tucker justice. It is a very interesting case. I highly recommend people look into it. And I hope I've given a bit of insight as to why I take it a step further than even the Christian fundamentalists did, believing she was demonically possessed through the methamphetamine use. And then once the drugs were out of her system and she sobered up, the entity had no more use for her. It could not get high releases of dopamine and norepinephrine, and confined in prison, there's nothing for it to do, so it departed and left the remains of her consciousness, which happened to be much, much more than what anyone would expect from her. She was not an empty shell. And what was so unusual about this case is she was not just an empty shell or a husk of a human being, like most people are when they commit this kind of crime and are in prison. They have their personalities usually completely destroyed, their consciousness shattered by the entity that was in them, and all that's left is these shards of a consciousness that is barely capable of being even called human. Yet hers was charismatic beyond all belief, and an entirely different person than whatever was in her that night in 1983 when she was mainlining meth while on a huge bender and ended the life of that woman. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I will catch you soon.